as we turn to the issue of the elections here in the United States, and that is Mr. Walter Smolarek, who's the editor of Liberation News. Walter, thanks for being back with us.
Thank you very much for having me back.
Well, we're glad to have you back, as always. A lot of discussion this week, of course, about Joe Biden and Donald Trump to some degree, but mainly Joe Biden because of the New York Times poll. I guess it came out on Monday. I can't remember now. But that plus a number of other polls showing Biden being very far down. So maybe before we get too deep into the implications of this, Walter, maybe just give us just at least a rough indication of what some of this polling has been showing about Biden versus Trump and other parties and individuals who are in the race.
Yeah, that's right. Well, this is not good news for Joe Biden. Not good news at all. Under the U.S. electoral system, there are some states that count and other states that do not count. And if you're lucky enough to live in the states that actually matter, the so-called swing states, then you get a voice in this democracy. So, if you look at those states, right, what are the swing states that are actually in contention? Their electoral college votes are actually, a toss up between the two candidates. Either could realistically get it. In essentially all of those, with maybe the exception of Minnesota, Donald Trump is up. In some states, he's up by a lot. Like in Georgia, he's up by a lot. Nevada, North Carolina. I mean, these are states that the Democrats would hope to be like highly competitive in. Donald Trump is leading essentially every professional poll in those states. And then you move to the so-called blue wall states in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And in those states, it's a little bit closer, but Trump is leading in essentially all of them. There's an odd poll here or there in Pennsylvania, Minnesota, sometimes in Wisconsin, that shows Biden up by a point or two. But essentially, in order for Biden to get an electoral college majority, he needs to win all four of those states. Unless he can pull off what's now looking like a very improbable victory in one of the other ones, he needs to win all four: Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And he might not win any if the current polling, especially this Monday report from CNN and New York Times, is accurate. So the Biden administration, the Biden campaign people, the Democratic Party are I think or should be in a state of panic over this. Donald Trump is leading in every single important poll.
Well, Walter, I want to ask you about some of the specifics here in this amazing democracy that we have, where people in only a handful of states matter in terms of their vote for these pre-approved candidates. What are they so upset about? I mean, isn't America and the world great right now, Walter? Like, what are these people whining about that they don't want to vote for President Biden? Or in some cases, Trump. Yeah.
Okay, so that is like actually the public relations strategy of the Democratic Party right now. Like isn't that remarkable? That's their messaging. Like everything is fine.
Crazy.
It's really easy to get a job. You should be so happy about the economy. Everything is wonderful, and if you don't get that, then maybe you don't read enough, or you're just ignorant, or there's something else going on. I mean, it's like so completely out of touch with the reality that people are dealing with. I mean, that's true just sort of in an objective sense, right? Like prices are really, really high. Wages are not high enough. Rent, especially, is skyrocketing. And then there's all the broken promises that Biden said he would carry through, follow through on, but did not. The expansion of social programs, free community college, universal pre-K, the PRO Act to make it much easier to form a union, cash payments, monthly cash payments for working class families. I mean, things that would really alleviate some of these things. And Biden said he would do. He did not do any of them. And in fact, presided over the rollback of supports for poor and working class and middle class people, like the freeze on student loan repayments, for instance. So there's a great amount of justified anger when you look at the situation in the United States. And certainly the situation internationally is decisive as well when it comes to Biden's well deserved unpopularity. First and foremost, the genocide in Gaza. So many people are absolutely furious that billions of dollars of our tax money is being used to fund a massacre, a killing spree, where tens of thousands of innocent people are being bombed or being shot. all with weaponry produced by the United States and paid for with our tax dollars. Biden is 100% culpable for that genocide, and there are millions of people who will never forgive him for that. And I think there's a similar dynamic playing out in the war in Ukraine. Maybe sort of less of a dramatic, acute crisis, but people are totally furious about the militarism and the waste of resources there too. So on many, many, many different fronts, Biden has been a complete disappointment.
Well, as you know, Bill Clinton famously said, or maybe it was one of his aides famously said, it's the economy, stupid. Obviously, the economy is always the number one issue in every single election for obvious reasons, because in capitalism, you must have money to survive. A lot of issues around the economy swirling around here, as you mentioned, Democrats saying it's good. But one of the other elements of the poll, the New York Times, Siena College, Philadelphia Inquirer poll that many people were pointing to, was large numbers of people saying that they were, in fact, thinking that the economy needed major changes or needs to be completely torn down. Talk about that element of that report, if you could, which has made some waves.
Yeah, I think this is just as interesting or more interesting than the Biden versus Trump numbers, because it shows the real opinion, the real state of mind of I think the clear majority of people in this country, which is that the choices being presented to us by this system are completely inadequate. They're insulting. They're infuriating. The idea that two of the most unpopular politicians in the country, like those are the only choices that you have, is something that's making people leading people to really radical conclusions about society. I think well founded ones. So yeah, about 69% of the population, according to this poll, thinks that the system, the political and economic system of the United States, needs to either undergo major changes or be torn down entirely. And that was the language they used, torn down, right? So it was this sort of militant, like fighting kind of spirit. That about 1 in 7 respondents agreed with that, right? So I think this says something both about the mentality of sort of the average voter, if you will. What is on the minds of people
Mm.
who are going to the polls. But I think it also says something even deeper and more profound about U.S. society, which is that there's a growing desire out there to actually fight for that change. We've seen it in the streets over and over and over, week after week after week for Gaza. We saw mass movements emerge many times in recent years, the 2020 protests against racism, environmental rights protests. There's this growing mass movement for change, for fundamental change in this society. And there's all sorts of twists and turns and unanswered questions as that movement grows. But I think that this poll showed a clear reflection that that is a large and growing and vibrant current in American politics seeking radical change in the political and economic system.
And Walter, I do want to ask you, there obviously is a lot of discontent at these as these polls show over very particular issues, but in moments like these, it's an opportunity for the left, of course, to try to organize people. It's also an opportunity for the right to try to convince people that the reason, the stuff that is actually wrong with the country is like immigrants and you know, poor people and, the Browns in other countries. That's typically what the right does. I'm curious if you could talk a bit about how someone like not just Trump, but what he represents, like moments like this, because liberals suck so bad, represent an opportunity for the far right to really come in and scoop up that discontent, especially because they have a massive media apparatus to spread their talking points to through.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just like Biden benefited so much in 2020 from just being not Donald Trump, Donald Trump is benefiting this time around from being not Joe Biden. Because the powers that be, if it were, right, the ruling administration is from the Democratic Party, Trump can come along and is coming along and posturing as an outsider, an opponent of the establishment. I mean, of course, this is all totally ridiculous considering that he was the president. He has been the billionaire for basically his whole life. So it's nonsense. It's demagoguery. But it's something that's a very real political phenomenon, something that we see throughout history, where the far right can come along and, unlike the liberals who are saying everything is fine and it's all in your head, acknowledge that yes, there are dramatic problems in society that's making your life very, very difficult, but providing false solutions and identifying, as you're saying, false enemies, right? Immigrants, LGBTQ people, unions, leftists, whatever. There's, an endless list of different scapegoats that the far right comes up with. So I think that is certainly Trump's playbook. That's what he's trying to do this time around, maybe with even more, militancy than in 2016 and in 2020 in terms of his calls for revenge, for clearing out the system, for getting rid of all the leftists. But yeah, I think that's essentially his playbook, posturing as the voice of the common man against the establishment,
Mm.
while at the same time doing things like giving $2 trillion of tax breaks to Wall Street and big corporations, bolstering the military industrial complex and so on.
No, it's a good point. Very, very good point. Walter, I want to ask you just sort of as you might not expect this one, but I think it's relevant in terms of how we view this because, you're a lifelong Pennsylvania resident. You're very familiar with the city of Philadelphia. And, obviously Kensington in the north part of Philadelphia, which you're familiar with, is often presented as sort of like, the videos of people using drugs, like the decline of America. And in a way, I was hoping you could speak about that in the context of all of these various different things that we're seeing in terms of the election and why people want change and what people want to see and so on and so forth. Because I think it's often just sort of caricatured, like look at the collapse of America in just sort of like a random way. But it's not really contextualized in terms of how these kind of things actually play out in a swing state like Pennsylvania that would lead people to stay home, vote for a third party, or just generally not be engaged with the political system.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's a really important way to frame it. And actually, to go to Kensington, so I lived in Kensington for a long time. Yeah, it's like the poster child. It's always held up by like right wing politicians who make it a campaign stop to be like, oh, look how terrible it is here. We've really got to get tough on crime. And I think it's a perfect example of uh, the type of maneuver that I was describing there, where you identify a very real, very pressing problem that's being ignored by establishment liberalism, but identify false culprits and offer false solutions, right? So the opioid crisis is terrible. It's a horrific problem, especially in Kensington, but it's a problem because of pharmaceutical corporations. That's who's responsible for this, right? I mean, the Sackler family, other owners of chain pharmacies, big, yeah, the big pharma essentially made a killing. I mean, made hundreds of billions of dollars, essentially introducing what were at the time banned opioids into the market and repackaging them as like legitimate medicines. This is a very well documented thing. There's been extensive court battles over it. Like clearly, this is the consequence of the total and unchecked greed of the pharmaceutical capitalists. Donald Trump comes along and says, well, the problem is either people who are suffering from drug addiction and presenting this as just a purely individual moral problem, or that it's China's fault. That somehow fentanyl and other opioids are flowing across the U.S. border, flowing into U.S. ports, and it's all coming from China, and it's part of some Chinese plot to undermine the fabric of U.S. society. No, it's not. It's not some foreign enemy. It's rich people right here in the United States.
No, it's a great point. Yeah, fentanyl and military age men; those are the two major issues that are there. I'm sorry, Rania, go ahead.
No, it's just such a clown show. Meanwhile, this country that we're supposed to feel so free in is just, Homeland Security stops people when they come into it and demands to know how they feel about Hamas.
Indeed.
It's just such a ridiculous circus and a
It
very
is.
dangerous one at that.
Well, thankfully, we have Liberation News and people like their editor, Walter Smolarek, out there helping us sort through it all. Walter, as always, we really appreciate you giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me.